In this presentation, we're going to be thinking about what really happened at the birth of Jesus. Now, you may, of course, think you know exactly what happened at the birth of Jesus, because, of course, if you're a parent like myself, you'll have been to a number of nativity plays, and you'll have seen the story acted out there by young children, or you'll have passed a church and you'll have seen a nativity scene set out, and maybe it looks something like this on the screen. Joseph and Mary, they're in a stable surrounded by animals with a baby Jesus in the manger, and there's some shepherds have just joined them, and some kings as well, and a bunch of camels, and then there outside are some angels looking down as they float around on their wings. That's a pretty traditional image of the nativity, and what we're going to do is just try and pick that apart a little in this presentation and consider actually whether that's what really took place when Jesus Christ was born. And there are two places that we need to be looking at to establish the facts of the matter. Out of the four gospel records that we have, which talk about the life and work of Jesus, it's Matthew in chapters 1 and 2, and it's Luke in chapters 1 and 2, who give us the full story of the birth and the events surrounding the birth of Jesus. So those are the chapters we're going to consider as we go through this presentation. So first of all, I want to think about places where, if you like, the nativity story that we're familiar with gets it right, and where we can say, oh yes, we can be confident that the detail there that we've come across is correct detail. And really, we should start off with the introduction to the story, where we're told about the conception of Jesus. And what you may be familiar with is the fact that we're told Mary is a virgin. She's not yet fully married. She's just betrothed to Joseph. That the conception of Jesus, therefore, is a miraculous event, and it's brought about by God's power, the Holy Spirit, which comes down upon Mary. And in fact, all of that comes straight out of the Bible narrative there in Luke chapter 1, where we read that Gabriel, the angel who appears to Mary, says to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the highest will overshadow you. Therefore also that Holy One who is to be born will be called the Son of God." So there you are. What we're used to in the nativity story is absolutely correct in this detail, because that's what Luke's gospel record tells us about the miraculous conception and birth of Jesus. And here's another detail where the nativity that we're used to gets it right as well. The idea of the journey which Joseph and Mary have to undertake, because one thing we're told in the Gospels is that they live in Nazareth, and therefore they make a journey down to Bethlehem, where Jesus is to be born, at the time when Mary is heavily pregnant. And all this comes about, a very unusual journey, because of a Roman taxation decree. And that's the detail we get at the beginning of Luke's Gospel in chapter 2, because we read there that it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Just as a matter of interest, it's that detail about the census and Quirinius being governor in Syria that allows us to date quite accurately around the time when Jesus was born. We also read that Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So you see, there's a lot of detail there about this journey and when it took place, and the fact that Mary was due to give birth. All of that then that we may be familiar with is absolutely right. I guess maybe the only question we might be left with is this one. Did as the popular story of the nativity goes, did Mary ride on a donkey all the way down from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Well, maybe she did, maybe she didn't. It was a common method of travel, and certainly for somebody heavily pregnant, it would be the best way for her to get there safely. But it's just one of those details that we're not actually told. So you can have Mary on a donkey if you wish, or not. as the case may be. Where things get a little bit more complicated is when they get to Bethlehem, because this is where we really get into the nativity tale, isn't it? And we have this very popular image of there being no room in the inn. And there we have Mary and Joseph going more and more desperately from door to door, every property, every guest house in Bethlehem, and nobody has room. And they end up, therefore, with Mary giving birth in a stable surrounded by the animals. Or actually, I've come across images of maybe a cave in a hillside that was used to keep animals in the winter months. And there Mary gives birth. Well, there is some basis for that idea, because there in Luke's record, we have this that we read. It says, while they were there in Bethlehem, the days were completed for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. So I guess at first sight we say, well, that's what Luke's gospel records. Clearly that's what happens. But actually we need to delve just a little bit deeper there to understand that the probable reality of what actually happened. You see, the reality is more likely this. Joseph and Mary, remember, will have had relatives in Bethlehem. That's where they came from. Both Joseph and Mary were of the line of David, the ancient king of Israel. And therefore, it's almost certain, isn't it, that if they went down to Bethlehem, somebody there, some relative, either close or distant, will surely have found room for them. How likely is it that in that village, every person, even their relatives, will have said, oh, your wife's almost ready to give birth? Nah, sorry, we can't help. Very unlikely indeed, isn't it? In actual fact, there's something that we need to appreciate, and that is that word translated in many Bible versions as inn is the Greek word kataluma, and it actually means literally a guest chamber, a room that would have been set aside for guests. And in most Jewish homes at that time, a guest chamber would have been a room upstairs, a room away from all the hustle and bustle of what was going on day to day in the house. And so actually there being no room in the inn is simply telling us that nobody at that time had a guest chamber available, an upstairs room where Joseph and Mary could go for some quiet and to be able to give birth with a bit of peace and comfort. In actual fact, if there was no upper guest chamber available, then they would be having to use one of the lower spaces in the home of somebody who may have been a relative. And those lower spaces where maybe daily work was carried out, maybe cooking was done, was also the place where a household may have brought their animals in at certain times of year. So it's no wonder, is it then, that there was a manger there, a trough where they would feed animals. And it was there then that Mary herself gave birth. So not quite the nativity scene of a stable or a cave on a hillside that Mary and Joseph are reduced to using for the birth of Jesus. I guess we've got to ask at a point like this, well, does it matter? Does it matter if the traditional nativity scene that we picture isn't actually that accurate an image? Well, I suppose what's seeing here is that it wasn't quite as destitute a situation as the one that we might imagine from the popular image. But having said that, it was still a very humble beginning, wasn't it, for a child who was born as the Son of God. This was no child being born in a king's palace who was going to be brought up with luxuries, but had a very humble beginning indeed. Let's carry on then and think about some of the other aspects that we come across in the birth story of Jesus. Let's think about the shepherds next. Were they really watching their flocks by night, as the popular Christmas carol has it? Did an angel actually appear to them, and then a host of angels singing praise to God? Did the shepherds actually go and visit the baby Jesus where he was in the manger? Those are the details that we'll be familiar with if we've seen a nativity play. Is that what actually happened? Well, in fact, that's pretty much what the gospel account tells us did take place. Here we are again in Luke chapter 2, and we read that there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Saviour, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger." And you notice that there's detail there, isn't there, that helps us to put things together a bit better. This vision of the angels appearing to the shepherds took place the same day that Jesus was born. That's what the angel says. To you is born this day. And the baby is still going to be there if they go and find him. He's still going to be lying in the manger. Nothing's changed from what we read a couple of verses ago about the birth itself. And there these shepherds are. They're out in the fields and it's night time. The only thing actually we perhaps need to pick up from this and realize is that whereas because Christmas as celebrated in the West is on December the 25th, we might imagine this being a very chilly night and snow lying in the fields. Actually, very unlikely to be that at all. But from what we work out about the age of Jesus, when he lived and when he worked and when he died, almost certainly this took place sometime in what in the UK would be the autumn months, maybe around September or October. So not a wintry scene by any stretch at all, but it was nighttime. It may have been cold, and the angel there did appear to them in glory. And a host of angels then followed on to sing praise to God in the presence of those shepherds. And there again, the only thing that maybe we need to be aware of here that really would jar with the popular image we have is that these angels that appeared as a host to sing praise to God, well, they almost certainly didn't have wings. In fact, all through the Bible, whenever we come across angels appearing to men and women on earth, they never are described as having wings. That's very much a popular misconception. So next time, if you ever go to another nativity play and you see lots of as I did with my own daughters, lots of little girls running around on stage with wings pinned to their backs, then really we're getting a bit of a misconception there altogether. Actually, one of the other things that we see about angels is that pretty much every occasion that they appear to men and women in the Bible, they appear as if they are men. So a group of what would appear to be men, no wings in sight at all, but the glory of God shining out from them, the brightness that's often depicted in images like these on the screen. Well, that certainly would have been the case there. Now, one of the important things actually about the angels appearing to the shepherds and then the shepherds going off to find this newborn babe is the fact that God was making sure on that occasion that there were witnesses to the birth of his son there in Bethlehem. And we see that actually when we read on in Luke's gospel record, because it says that so it was when the angels had gone away from them into heaven that the shepherds said to one another, "Let us now go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has come to pass, which the Lord has made known to us." And they came with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in the manger. Now, when they had seen him, they made widely known the saying which was told them concerning this child. And all those who heard it marveled at those things which were told them by the shepherds. And you know, that's a really important detail that's given us there, that the birth of Jesus, although it was a really humble origin for God's son, even though it took place, you know, just in a downstairs room in somebody's house in Bethlehem, it wasn't in a palace, it wasn't announced with trumpets and great proclamation in Jerusalem, even though it was such a small event, yet it was actually talked about to many people, because we see there that the shepherds, They all saw it, and they went and told many other people. And you can imagine then that years later, when Luke, the gospel writer, came to write his gospel record of what had taken place, it wasn't just Mary he could talk to and say, well, tell me about the birth of your son and what happened. Actually, there would still be people around in Bethlehem, maybe some of the shepherds, maybe some of those that they witnessed to, who would be able to say to Luke, yes, we know this took place because we heard about it, or we were there. And therefore God makes this record secure and something we can take confidence in as a record that was actually witnessed by many. So let's go on then and think a little bit further and go on to maybe one of the areas around the nativity story that is most commonly misunderstood, and it's the visit of the wise men. You see, there are a whole range of misconceptions around this visit. First of all, if you think that we have the Christmas carol, don't we? We three kings of Orient are. One misunderstanding is the thought that they were kings, or that there were three of them, or that they had names that have carried on down through the years. I remember discovering, to my surprise, as a child, that these three men actually were given names, or that they arrived on the same night that the shepherds were there, having been sent by the angels, or that they had been led all the way that they journeyed by a star. All of these are things that maybe the popular story gets wrong. So let's unpick the detail and see what we're actually told or not told in the gospel records about this visit. And here we are. This is recorded for us in Matthew's record, where in chapter 2 he says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we've seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, the first detail we see there is that these were wise men. These weren't kings at all, but the word in Greek is the word that we would translate and use as magi these days. And in actual fact, we can see straight away by what they say that their area of expertise was that they were astrologers. And coming from the east, almost certainly these men had traveled all the way, the hundreds of miles from Babylonia, which was a real center of astrology from ancient times. Notice as well, there's no mention of how many of them that there were. We always assume that there were three simply because they provide three gifts to Jesus, but that's very much an assumption. It could have been as few as three, it could have been many of them traveling together. Did they arrive at the same time as the shepherds? Really very unlikely indeed, because it will have taken them months to have traveled to Judea from where they started off across in Babylonia. And actually, even the idea of the star leading them all the way is one that isn't there in the record, is it? What they say is, we have seen his star in the east. So they saw his star, and that prompted them to then come to Jerusalem in search of the King of the Jews. And actually that raises a question for us, doesn't it? You know, nobody else in Judea seems to have picked up that the King of the Jews had been born, and yet these men from hundreds of miles away knew exactly what had taken place. How come? Well, there is a significance to this star, isn't there? And what we need to realize is that actually Babylon, where these men probably came from, was a place where hundreds of years before, the Jewish prophet Daniel, as an exile from his own land, had been a preeminent wise man. He'd been one of the chief of the magi in Babylon at the time of the great king Nebuchadnezzar. He'd been taken captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. And it was Daniel who made one of the most significant prophecies in the Old Testament about the coming of the Jewish Messiah, God's king, the King of the Jews. And here it is, this part of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. And it's all about time periods and what would happen. And the angel says to Daniel in this prophecy, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks, or 7 sevens, and 62 weeks, 62 sevens." So a period of 69 sevens. And this is talking about sevens of years. So in actual fact, there's a starting point about rebuilding Jerusalem, and 69 sevens later, we come to the time of the Messiah. In other words, for those who understood this prophecy, they would know already that around this time, when Jesus was born, that would be the time when Messiah the Prince, God's promised King of the Jews, would appear. So people over there in Babylon, they were waiting for that, and perhaps many people in Israel were also waiting for that event. Well, that doesn't tie in with the star, does it? But perhaps if we go back a little further in Old Testament prophecy, actually right back to the time of Moses, we find there's another prophecy which links this ruler to a star. And it's actually in the book of Numbers. It's a prophecy given by a man called Balaam. And he talks of this distant coming of God's king. And he says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel." And there in that maybe somewhat cryptic prophecy is a linkage, isn't there, between a star and a scepter, a ruler who would come out of the people of Israel. And maybe then it was these wise men of the East who were able to put together these prophecies and realize that them seeing a star at this time, when they were expecting the Jewish Messiah to appear, they were able to bring these together and say, well, the star is a sign that it's happened. And off they went on their journey. Which brings us maybe to one of the last questions. Well, where did that journey actually take them? Did the wise men visit Jesus as he was lying there in the manger? Well, almost certainly not. Remember, we've seen already this would be a journey that would take many months. And of course, first of all, they went to Jerusalem and inquired with people there and had to be sent on again from Jerusalem. So Jesus would have been a toddler by the time that these men actually found him. And in actual fact, the terminology that's used by the gospel writer Matthew actually gives us a hint of that, because we read there in Matthew chapter 2 that when they'd come into the house, they saw the young child, not the babe, but the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they'd opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And of course, there our popular nativity scene actually is fulfilled, isn't it, in the 3 gifts. But this was no babe in a manger they were presenting the gifts to, but a young child who, probably oblivious to them, was running around in the house at the time. Well, we need to think about that then, don't we? Were they then led to that house where the toddler Jesus was by a star? They'd seen a star in the east, hadn't they? And this had motivated them to make the journey all the way across to the region of Judea. But we're also told that a star led them to a very specific house where Jesus was. In the previous 2 verses in Matthew, it says, "Behold, the star which they'd seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy." Now, that's really odd, isn't it? Because you and I know stars are very much fixed in the heavens. Even a comet, which passing over, that's moving across the sky, doesn't tend to move from day to day, does it? And yet this star actually goes before them and stands over the house. They were able to identify a house by where the star was. And what that suggests to us is that this was no ordinary star at all, but that in actual fact, what they may have seen was a very bright light in the sky that God provided. In fact, it may even have been an angel shining with the glory of God, that therefore was able to move across the sky ahead of them, which would be clear to them as being a star to follow, but also would be able to highlight a specific house when it arrived there. And where was that house? Because all along we've been assuming that that house is in Bethlehem, haven't we? But was it? You see, Jesus by this time would already have been taken away from Bethlehem, because his parents, Mary and Joseph, her husband, took Jesus up to the temple after the time of Mary's purification following giving birth. And actually that's recorded for us in Luke's gospel records. So they've gone away from Bethlehem by this time. And I think it's unlikely that they would have gone back there again. That wasn't their home. They'd only gone there for taxation purposes, to be registered in this census, and then presumably will have moved on. Well, they won't necessarily have gone back to Nazareth. In fact, the account in Matthew very much suggests they hadn't gone back to Nazareth. But what they may well have done is gone to just another town in the Judean hill country where Mary's cousin Elizabeth lived with her husband Zacharias and their young son, who became known later as John the Baptist. And perhaps for a time they stayed there, maybe to be in with other family, bringing up another child, and also perhaps to be fairly close to Jerusalem if they intended to make sure that as he grew up, the young child Jesus had access to the best teachers of God's law in the country in Jerusalem. And so Jesus may have been at least 18 months old, living in that household when the wise men visited. In actual fact, we've got a real hint that he was at least that old from what we read on, because when the wise men have visited and then gone home by a different way, avoiding going back to Herod, we read then in Matthew 2:16 that Herod, when he saw he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. So that tells us, doesn't it, that he questioned them closely when they arrived in Jerusalem and worked out when they'd seen the star, how long it was now, and actually, maybe for safety's sake, he had every male child under 2 killed, which means that certainly Jesus was on towards that age at this point in time. So a very different picture we get there from perhaps what we imagine from a typical nativity play. Let's finish up then by trying to put together a more accurate picture. Here we go. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but probably not in a stable or a cave, but just in the lower part of a house where animals also would be kept on occasions. Whether there are animals there at the time, we don't know. The manger certainly wasn't full of cattle feed, but was able to be used as a place to rest the newborn babe. The shepherds did visit that same night, or certainly within the 24 hours after Jesus was born, having been told of his birth by the angels, just as we imagine. But Joseph and Mary maybe stayed in Bethlehem until Jesus was 6 weeks old, and then at that point they headed off to Jerusalem to make the offering there in the temple, where 2 prophets also came and made prophecies about the babe. And then they went from there, in all likelihood, to stay with their relatives in Judea with Zacharias and Elizabeth. And that's where they were still when the wise men came bringing their gifts to the young child. And actually, not only were the wise men warned not to go back to Herod, but Joseph and Mary too were warned by God in a dream to flee from that area. And so they fled to Egypt until Herod was dead. That's really what happened at the birth of Jesus. And actually all that detail and some of the things that were missing that we don't need to worry about are all there in 4 chapters for us to read in the gospel records. And again, we might finish off by saying, well, does it matter? Does it matter if we have a slightly romanticized or inaccurate image of what happened at the birth of Jesus? You know, this is a well-known Bible story, isn't it? And yet, many of the images that we may believe are from the Bible turn out actually to be popular misconceptions, little things that have built up over the centuries and have been added in to this story so that it's not quite what it seems anymore. Well, what it does is it shows to you and me the importance of us reading the Bible record for ourselves, not just listening to others and hearing what they tell us the Bible says, but actually looking at the words on the page so that we know what God has said and can take in the message for ourselves. You see, it is important that we do that. If you and I want to hear and then respond to God's message of salvation, a message that's centered on Jesus Christ, then we need to make the effort to make sure that the gospel we're hearing is actually the true gospel. And to do that, we need to be looking at the Bible itself. So thank you for joining me in this Gospel Online presentation. There's a website there that you can visit for more information about the gospel message, gospelonline.co.uk. And of course, you can visit our Facebook page, Gospel Online UK, where all the presentations are uploaded over time. And also you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I hope you'll do that so that you can keep coming back and learning more and seeing more of what the true gospel message is, because it's God's offer of hope for the future of eternal life to you and to me. Thank you.